October 1944. The sun had barely risen over the Pacific, but the airstrip at Saipan was already alive with activity. Men and women in flight suits moved quickly across the tarmac, the screech of engines filling the air as B-29 Superfortresses were readied for their next mission. These were not just any aircraft. The B-29 was the future of warfare, advanced flying fortress, capable of carrying devastating payloads across thousands of miles. Its very presence symbolized the shifting tides of the war. Yet behind these colossal machines were a group of young women who would become an indispensable part of the B-29 story. They were the girls of the Air Transport Command pilots, engineers, and mechanics, whose names and faces would go largely unrecognized by history, but whose work was vital to the success of the Pacific Theater as dawn broke. The whir of propellers signaled the beginning of another mission. The women, many of whom were barely out of their teens, moved with focused precision, ensuring that the massive bombers would reach their destinations in one piece. They were not military personnel in the traditional sense. They were part of a civilian program, trained to deliver B-29s from the factories in the United States to the front lines of the war. The Air Force called them girls. Their jobs, however, were anything but trivial. Their path had not been easy. Most were part of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, WAS, the groundbreaking program that had been established in 1942 to fill the growing demand for pilots during the war. But as the need for more experienced pilots in combat zones increased, the role of these women grew far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The WAS pilots were asked to deliver aircraft directly to the front lines, a task that required navigating through enemy territory, dodging anti-aircraft fire, and ensuring that their cargo, some of the most sophisticated bombers in the world, arrived intact. It was under a blanket of secrecy that they worked. They had no official military rank, no formal recognition, and were not even covered under military insurance. Yet they had been trained as pilots, and they were entrusted with the most crucial of missions. Their dedication went unacknowledged by many, but without their tireless efforts, the strategic bombing campaigns that turned the tide of war in the Pacific could not have been carried out. These women, often in the shadows of history, had played a pivotal role in delivering the B-29 Superfortresses that would eventually deliver the decisive blows to Japan. The scale of their mission was immense. From the moment a B-29 rolled off the assembly lines at factories like Boeing's in Wichita, Kansas, it was handed over to these women who were tasked with flying it to its designated base. Whether in the Pacific Islands or China, the aircraft were delicate, their complex systems requiring constant adjustments during the journey. But these girls were no strangers to adversity. Trained to handle any challenge, they flew over vast stretches of ocean, through thick clouds, and around fierce storms. One of the most dangerous parts of the mission was the long flight over the Pacific Ocean. The journey could take up to 18 hours with no guarantee of safety. Often, the women had to fly solo, navigating in isolation, sometimes encountering Japanese fighters or harsh weather conditions. Yet, despite these overwhelming odds, they carried out their duties with unwavering professionalism. The Japanese forces, however, were not the only threat. Mechanical failure was a constant danger. The B-29s were notorious for their fragile systems. A single malfunction could bring the entire mission to a catastrophic end. But it was the bond between these women, the girls of the Air Transport Command, that kept them going. They shared a camaraderie that was born of necessity, but grew into something deeper. They were more than just co-workers. They were sisters in arms, a force united by their determination to serve their country and support the war effort. They carried the weight of history on their shoulders, yet their efforts went largely unsung. As the war raged on, their numbers grew, and their role in the war effort became more critical. By the time the war in the Pacific had reached its apex, these women had delivered hundreds of B-29 bombers to strategic bases across the Pacific. Their contributions were often overshadowed by the men who piloted the aircraft in combat, but without them, the success of the B-29 campaign would have been impossible. The airfields in the Pacific were often little more than dirt strips, carved out of tropical islands with makeshift buildings and tents. But for the women of the Air Transport Command, these were the places where their skills and courage were tested. They flew the B-29s through extreme conditions, ensuring that the bombers were ready to be used in combat missions, often just hours after arriving at their destination. Their responsibility was immense. These bombers were among the most advanced and powerful aircraft in the world. They were designed to carry massive payloads to Japanese cities and factories, and the women who delivered them understood the gravity of their task. They were not just delivering planes. They were delivering the power that would eventually bring the war to an end. As the war came to its bitter conclusion in 1945, the girls of the Air Transport Command were finally able to return home. For many, their missions were completed without fanfare. They had served their country with distinction, but when the war ended, the recognition they deserved was slow to come. The WASP program was disbanded, and many of these women returned to civilian life, often without the public acknowledgement that they had earned. Some went on to pursue careers in aviation. Others started families or entered other fields. Yet, despite their invaluable contribution to the war effort, their legacy was often forgotten. It was only decades later, when the stories of these unsung heroes began to resurface, that the world began to understand the magnitude of their contribution. In the years following the war, the WASP pilots were finally recognized by the U.S. government, receiving the Congressional Gold Medal in 2009. Yet even today, the full extent of their role in the Pacific Campaign remains underappreciated. The girls of the Air Transport Command were not just pilots, they were pioneers, breaking down barriers in a world that had not yet fully embraced women in combat roles. They served on the front lines of history, in the skies above the Pacific, delivering the B-29 Superfortresses that would change the course of the war. And while the world may have called them girls, they were in every sense of the word warriors. Their story is one of courage, of defiance, and of a duty fulfilled in the face of impossible odds. They were the unsung heroes of the B-29 campaigns, the women who flew the bombers to the front lines, and in doing so, helped deliver victory in the Pacific. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, not just as a footnote in history, but as a testament to the bravery and determination of those who refused to be overlooked. They were more than just girls. They were the backbone of a victory that would define the 20th century. And as the B-29s roared across the skies, their engines screaming through the air, the women who had delivered them to the front could only look back, knowing that they too had played a pivotal role in the final victory. The war had been won, but the story of those who helped bring it to its conclusion was just beginning. As the war ended in 1945, the women of the Air Transport Command returned home, but their contributions remained largely invisible to the public eye. For years, they had flown through hostile skies, navigating vast stretches of ocean to deliver the B-29 Superfortresses that would play a decisive role in the war. Yet, despite their critical role in the success of the Pacific Campaign, many of them returned to civilian life without the recognition they deserved. There was no fanfare, no celebrations, and no parades. Their names were not etched into the annals of military history as they should have been. They had served their country with valor, but the nation, it seemed, had forgotten their sacrifice. When the WASP program was disbanded after the war, these women were left to quietly slip into civilian life. They took on traditional roles in society, returning to their homes, families, and communities. Some would continue flying as civilian pilots, others would work in offices, raise children, and rebuild their lives after the war. But for most, the legacy of their work remained unspoken. They had been part of a groundbreaking program that helped reshape the role of women in the military. But for decades, their contributions were largely ignored. Their service had been critical to the success of the B-29 campaigns, yet they were not recognized as veterans. The decision to disband the WASP program after the war was rooted in the belief that the need for women pilots had passed. The military shifted back to relying on male pilots. The women who had served so valiantly were told their work was no longer necessary. They were not offered the benefits given to male veterans, and in many cases, their service was dismissed by both the public and the military establishment. Their roles were considered temporary, and their importance to the war effort was minimized. But over time, the contributions of these women began to surface. In the 1970s, as the feminist movement gained momentum, a renewed interest in the role of women in the military led to the rediscovery of the WASP pilots. Their stories, once buried under the weight of history, were being told again, slowly but surely. As more veterans and military historians began to recognize the sacrifices these women had made, the calls for recognition grew louder. In 1977, the U.S. government granted the WASP veterans the honorary status of veterans, finally acknowledging their contributions to the war effort. But it wasn't until 2009, more than 6 decades after the war had ended, that the WASP pilots were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, long overdue recognition of their service. For many of the women, this acknowledgement came too late. Some had passed away before they could receive the recognition they had earned. But for those who remained, the award was a bittersweet victory. They had served during a time when their contributions were undervalued, and they had faced countless challenges, both on and off the battlefield. They had been called girls by the military, but their actions had been nothing short of heroic. And though the world may have forgotten their names for many years, the legacy of their service will never be erased. Their role in the Pacific Campaign was crucial to the success of the B-29 missions. Without the girls of the Air Transport Command, those bombers would not have made it to their targets. The B-29 Superfortresses were essential to the Allied strategy in the Pacific, and the women who delivered them played a key role in ensuring their effectiveness. These women didn't just fly aircraft, they kept them in the air, fixing problems mid-flight, navigating through enemy territories, and ensuring that the bombers arrived at their destinations intact. Their work was often invisible, but it was no less vital to the Allied victory in a broader sense. Their legacy extends beyond the history of World War II. They were pioneers, breaking down barriers for women in aviation and military service, their determination to serve their country, despite the risks and the challenges they faced, paved the way for future generations of women in the military. Today, women fly fighter jets, serve in combat roles, and hold high-ranking positions in the military. All thanks in part to the sacrifices of these early pioneers. The B-29 Superfortress campaigns in the Pacific were a turning point in modern warfare, and the women who flew those planes, those girls who delivered them to the front, were an integral part of that story. They may not have received the recognition they deserved in their time, but history has begun to catch up with their contributions. Their courage, skill, and unwavering determination should never be forgotten. The last B-29 mission had been completed. The war had ended. Yet the girls of the Air Transport Command knew that their work had been vital. They had delivered the weapons that would bring the war to a close, and in doing so, had ensured that victory would be theirs as well. They had been more than just pilots. They had been the silent warriors of the air, carrying the weight of a nation on their shoulders. And though their names were lost in the pages of history for far too long, they will never be forgotten again. For these women, the war was not just a job, it was a mission. And they accomplished it with honor, skill, and courage. They were not just girls, they were heroes. And their legacy is one that will endure for generations to come. Their story is a reminder that the true cost of victory is not always measured in battles won or cities conquered, but in the unsung heroes who quietly do their part to ensure that victory is achieved. They were the ones who flew the B-29s to the front, the ones who delivered the power that would bring the war to its final end. And in doing so, they proved that heroes come in many forms, and their legacy is woven into the fabric of history. The years that followed the end of the war brought an undeniable change. The airfields in the Pacific, where so many of these women had spent their days delivering B-29 Superfortresses, gradually emptied. The roar of the engines, the whir of propellers, and the sharp calls of flight crews that had filled the air now fell silent. The B-29s, their engines stilled and their missions completed, became relics of the past. Yet for those who had lived through it, the girls who had delivered the bombers to the front, what remained was not simply the quiet of peace, but the complex silence of victory and loss. As the world turned its gaze toward rebuilding, these women, many of whom had been part of a pioneering generation of female aviators, were forced to reconcile their experiences. For some, The war had been a time of personal growth and accomplishment, but one marked by the quiet weight of a forgotten history. The recognition that came decades later was far from the instant acknowledgement they had hoped for. For many of these women, the heroes who helped win the war were reduced to mere footnotes in a war that had been dominated by men. The truth is, the public and historical understanding of these women's contributions was incomplete, and much of their story had been lost to the winds of time. By the 1950s, most of the women who had been part of the WASP program in the Air Transport Command had returned to their civilian lives. Some continued to fly, seeking work with airlines or private companies. Others settled into family life, leaving behind their military careers. But the war had left an indelible mark on them. Many of them carried the weight of their service silently, their memories tucked away behind smiles and the routine of post-war life. The decision to fly bombers into enemy territory, to face the very real dangers of mechanical failure, hostile fighters, and treacherous weather, it shaped them in ways that few others could understand. Yet even as their roles in the war remained largely unrecognized, their impact on the aviation world continued to be felt. The 1970s marked a turning point for many of these women. As the feminist movement began to gain traction, stories of the contributions of women during the war began to resurface. A new generation of historians, researchers, and veterans began to examine the role of women in the war, bringing to light the untold stories of the WASP pilots and the women who had worked behind the scenes in support of the B-29 missions. Slowly, the truth about their contributions began to emerge, as women who had once been relegated to the margins of history were finally given the recognition they had long deserved. In 1977, the U.S. government granted the WASP veterans honorary status as military veterans, acknowledging the groundbreaking work they had done during the war. But it was not until 2009, more than 6 decades after their service, that the women of the WASP program were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor in the United States. The ceremony, which took place in Washington, D.C., was a long overdue recognition of their service. But it also highlighted a painful truth: these women had served without recognition for far too long. For the women who had flown B-29s across the Pacific, the Congressional Gold Medal was a moment of validation. But it was also a reminder of all that had been overlooked. Some of them had passed away by then, their service forgotten by all but a few. Others, now elderly, had lived their lives knowing that they had played a key role in the war, but without the formal acknowledgement that they had earned. Their contributions were finally recognized, but for many, the delay had been too long, and the recognition too little. The story of the girls who delivered the B-29 Superfortresses to the front lines is more than just the tale of women in wartime. It is a story of sacrifice, of dedication, and of the untold role that women played in shaping the outcome of World War II. The B-29 campaigns in the Pacific, with their strategic bombings and long-range missions, were pivotal to the Allied victory. Yet these women, who delivered the very aircraft that carried the bombs to Japan, remained hidden in the background for decades. Their contributions, though essential to the success of the war, were not celebrated until long after the dust had settled and the world had moved on. In their quiet heroism, these women helped to redefine the role of women in the military and in aviation. Their bravery, skill, and determination laid the groundwork for the future of women in combat roles and in the skies. Today, women serve in combat positions in the military, pilot fighter jets, and hold leadership roles in aviation. The legacy of the WASP pilots and the girls of the Air Transport Command lives on in these advancements. But their story is not just one of progress, it is a story of resilience, of a generation that did what was necessary, even when no one was watching. Their legacy, like the B-29 Superfortresses they delivered, is a testament to the power of quiet determination. They were not the ones who received medals on the front lines or had their names printed in the history books. Yet without them, the war in the Pacific would not have been won. The B-29s that brought the war to its final conclusion were made possible by the women who delivered them, often at great personal risk, through dangerous skies and enemy lines. And while their story may have been left out of the history books for many years, Their role in securing victory Canatand will not be forgotten. In the end, these women were not just girls. They were pioneers, warriors, and unsung heroes. Their story is a powerful reminder that history is shaped not only by the generals and commanders, but also by the countless individuals whose names remain unknown to all but a few. They were the backbone of a victory that changed the world, and their contributions continue to resonate. Through the ranks of women who serve in the military and aviation today, they may have been called girls by the military, but in truth, they were something much more. They were the ones who delivered the B-29s to the front, the ones who carried the weight of the war on their shoulders, and the ones who proved that bravery knows no gender. And in the quiet of those final missions, as the B-29s roared across the Pacific skies, they knew that their part in the victory was as crucial as any other.